It's a very prescient and salient point by Ayn Rand. It's a stage of just brutal depravity. The fact that human beings lack any sort of moral conviction or courage or any sort of individuality within that sort of system. And systems like that have manifested in the past, and they create the worst sort of tyrannies possible. And it's antithetical to human nature, which is why human nature ultimately rises up against it. But then it seems like over time, due to the successes of individual sort of cultures that emerged from that sort of tyrannical situation, I don't know, it's just the success of the sort of economic struggle that emerges from that. But for some reason, to the wealth generated, it seems to go back into a sort of downward spiral or downward trend. And there's this sort of ebb and flow of culture and history that one certainly can analyze and becomes conspicuous if one studies history long enough. We could talk about the Roman Empire, the Greek city states, even before then, the Achaemenid Empire, which would be the Persian Empire, and its rise and fall. And there's certainly, I mean, Will Durant used to point out this, but there's a definite moral decay that takes place within the culture itself that is sort of a metastasized cancer that doesn't always come from prescriptive authorities on top. It comes from the fact that a moral decay happens in the average person, or a sort of apathy develops due to the excesses of normal life that are available to them, and they don't engage in any sort of courageous behavior. This is obviously echoed by individuals at a more psychological level, like Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and obviously a sort of contemporary or modern interpretation of those ideas would be Jordan Peterson, that talks about the sort of hero idea and the call to action of the hero. And oftentimes what's not mentioned about the hero's journey, that the hero and the most significant stories has to be sacrificed. So there is an ultimate sacrifice in this struggle. I mean, when you use the example of the Russian that stood up and decided to publish pamphlets and go about distributing them in Soviet Russia, he knew that he was going to sacrifice his mother's position and he was going to be sentenced to the gulag. He knew that was going to happen. So at what point when do we reach our breaking point? We had discussion with Brett Venat, and privately I've talked to him about this, and he and I agreed. One of the things that's very pernicious about our situation, this alludes to what Aaron Dykes was talking about, is the issue of we live in a society of such hyperabundance that it's very easy to give people at least the semblance of the idea of meeting their most basic of needs, food and shelter. And of course, with the internet and this sort of intermediary between consciousness and this closed system it creates, we're at a precedent in history never before experienced. And rather, a precedent is now being set in history, where we're not sure if like a sort of a courageous individual will rise up and will overcome the sort of tyranny that's manifesting. Because before, in the past, in other words, people responded to the incentive of the inability to meet the most basic of needs. And right now, with this machine culture, this automated culture that's developing economically, it's likely that at least those most basic of needs will be met across a large swaths of populations, not only in the West, but the East, and even in developing countries. And that's very pernicious because we don't know what that's going to look like in the future. In other words, do they have us so well mapped out, especially this element of standing up against the tyranny, that they have this built into the model that they're rolling out? And so far, this intermediary, this cybernetic feedback loop they're creating through the Panopticon technocracy they're bringing in, and will that prevent that sort of natural element in the human spirit to want to rise up against it? It remains to be seen. It certainly does. I do want to just point out, I mean, because Aaron Dykes brought this up, and Rich and I had read this book many, many, many years ago. Let me see here. I have the page I want to talk about, but I'm just going to get into it very quickly. Obviously, The Human Use of Human Beings by Cybernetics, or then subtitle Cybernetics in Society by Norbert Weiner. So I'm not going to run to my library and try to dig through and find the copy, but there's a couple key sections I wanted to point out. And while I scroll back to the section I had highlighted, which is on page 152, I want to go over the definition of cybernetics, at least etymologically speaking, and how it's used in different contexts and different times. So cybernetics, a noun, theory or study of communication control, coined 1948 by U.S. mathematician Norbert Weiner, 1894 to 1964. Latinized from Greek kybernetes, which means steersman, metaphorically guide or governor, from kybernin, to steer or pilot a ship, direct as a pilot, figuratively to guide or govern, which is of uncertain origin. Beeks agrees that the word has no cognates and concludes foreign origin is probable. The construction is perhaps based on 1830s French cybernetique, the art of governing. Cybernetique, something like that, however you pronounce French. And going to the work, let me see here. So this carries on the metaphor of being a steersman or helmsman of a ship. On page 152, Weiner writes, here, feedback is used to regulate the velocity of a machine. In the ship's steering engine, it regulates the position of the rudder. The man at the wheel operates a light transmission system, employing chains or hydraulic transmission, which moves a member in the room containing the steering engine. There is some sort of apparatus which notes this distance between this member and the tiller, and this distance controls the admission of steam to the ports of a steam steering engine or some similar electrical admission in the case of an electrical steering engine. Whatever the particular connections may be, this change of admission is always in such a direction as to bring into coincidence the tiller and the member actuated from the wheel. Thus, one man at the wheel can do with ease what a whole crew could only do with difficulty at the old manpower wheel. And so what he's doing is and in this chapter, if I scroll up, it's called the First and Second Industrial Revolution. So he's sort of comparing and contrasting sort of manpower and the emerging sort of automated state, the sort of the scientific management, the assembly line mentality, machines able to do mass production. And then he's talking about it in the context of greater and greater efficiency, where man gains even more control over a machine in the context of like a steersman, for example, especially a more complex steam-powered engine. And more when humans were needed to help amplify those jobs, now those jobs are no longer needed. Jobs in the loosest sense of the word, meaning that this technology stands in place of that as an intermediary. And now one person can do what many men could only dream of doing in this closed system. Now, when we fast forward it a little bit, now he talks about this in the first and second industrial revolution. The second is sort of like machine to machine communication, and this idea of feedback and automation on a level of complex machinery, where beyond just rote organization and tasks that are pre-programmed, there's a sort of fuzzy logic that can emerge. There's a sort of ability to be able to do probabilistic models and almost an emerging simulacrum of consciousness within the machine itself, which will render human beings even more useless and more worthless, at least in the context of needing to do nothing more than fix any machines that break down. But of course, the machines might be able to fix themselves over time. So again, going with Aaron Dykes' point, is pushing the human being farther and farther out of being altogether. And so if we fast forward to page 159, I think this is sort of an important element here, if I remember correctly. In other words, the machine plays no favorites between manual labor and white-collar labor. Thus, the possible fields into which the new industrial revolution is likely to penetrate are very extensive and include all labor-performing judgments of a low level, in much the same way as the displaced labor of the early industrial revolution included every aspect of human power, human capital. There will, of course, be human capital in the form of physical labor, I should say. There will, of course, be trades into which the new industrial revolution will not penetrate, either because of new control machines are not economical in industries on so small a scale as not to be able to carry the considerable capital costs involved, or because their work is so varied that new taping will be necessary for almost every job. I cannot see automatic machinery of the judgment replacing type coming into the use in the corner grocery or in the corner garage, although I can very well see it employed by the wholesale grocer and the automobile manufacturer, which we've already seen today in our own times. The farm laborer, too, although he is beginning to be pressed by automatic machinery, is protected from the full pressure of it because of the ground he has to cover, the variability of the crops he must till, which is obviously trying to be genetically engineered to be more and more automated on that level as well. When we look at what Monsanto and Bayer and these other chemical ag companies are doing, and the special conditions of weather and the like that he must meet. And they're trying to control the weather You can see everything they're looking at through the lens of a prescriptive closed system feedback loop, where they'll be able to run these probabilistic models and try to generate the best outcome and act upon that without needing much human interaction, if any at all. Even here, the large scale or plantation farmer is becoming increasingly dependent on cotton. So he goes into examples. But the point, I think, is that he's pointing out that both blue and white collar jobs are largely going to become an aspect of the past. Weiner, obviously, or Wiener, is an interesting figure in history, both in mathematics, but certainly in the cybernetics movement. And I'll watch it over, I think, in part 2. I don't know if we got to it, but there's a whole section, I think, a little bit on some of his contributions. But it's fascinating. I mean, obviously, I do have the brain, but I'm not going to bring it up right now, Rich's brain, to show all the ominous connections associated with perpetuating these ideas, especially amongst the global elite. But he is one of the mathematical spokesperson, this continuation of creating a society, an automated society where human beings become less and less needed, which of course goes avongside, sort of the UNESCO, Julian Huxley, eugenics concept, going back to Galton and Thomas Huxley's father being evolutionary biologist and Galton being a psychometric statistician and mathematician himself, following the line of Thomas Malthus, and the geometric problem of population growth. In other words, there's a eugenics line that ties itself the whole way back to not the origins, but only a century or two after the origins of the Royal Society, of perpetuating a new idea about human beings and a new idea of, I think, the human position, and apotheosizing this new emerging science, making it godlike, while at the same time disposing of the old mechanisms of control, which were your standard religions based off faith. And now we can dominate the world. As Francis Bacon, I think, stated or uttered, knowledge is power, and nature to be nature to be obeyed must be understood. I believe something to that effect. And by using our knowledge, and he championed the inductive method, we'll be able to understand and control nature. And that was sort of the, much of the Enlightenment era aspect of this, the age of reason and so forth and so on. It's this idea of gaining more and more control of our environment, but doing so, interestingly, has not amputated this necessary need for something of the effect of a religious notion of transcendence. Now we're just doing it instead of through faith and prayer and whatever the various church or various theologies preach. Now we're doing it through actual physical interaction with machines and technology. And obviously individuality is being completely rewritten in that script. And we're only seeing sort of the worst and beginning to understand some of the horrific manifestations and machinations that could emerge from that realization. Weaponizing the religious instinct in human beings, I think, is really one of the most pernicious elements that's happening and has happened throughout all of history, but is manifesting itself now in one of the worst situations possible because we have advanced technology. So it's manifesting itself in technology instead of just some abstract belief or faith, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that ties into a lot of what Daniel McCarthy does in trying to understand this idea of utopianism, something Carl Jung stated as one of the primary archetypes inside the human collective unconscious. This call back to a golden age that is we all sort of yearn for, but in the yearning for that, what is not realized is in every golden age there seems to be a lack of individuality and a lack of distinction. So there's an inherent paradox with the idea of a golden age utopia and individuality, distinction, and volition. Okay. With that being said, stupid late.
What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happened. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions. We can get into the show and share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job to, as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man. Come